World for more. The international interest editor-in-chief, Sami Hamdi, joins us live from London. Hi, Sami, great to see you again. I'm sure you are not at all surprised by these numbers.
Sorry, could you repeat? I couldn't hear the beginning of it, sorry.
No, I'm just saying, according to this new report which you've seen, I am sure you are not at all surprised by the numbers.
That Saudi Arabia is the world's largest importer of arms. No, not surprised at all. I think with regards to Saudi Arabia, part of this policy of importing the arms is more politics than it is a desire to actually use those arms. It's the way that it lobbies, it's the way that it schmoozes the US, which is the most vital security partner, and the way in which, I mean, let's give another example aside from Saudi Arabia, the way in which the UAE managed to keep France on board. It promises France, which is going through an economic crisis, that it will spend billions on those weapons. This is the foreign policy that the Gulf states operate in order to ensure that the Americans and the Europeans are always on side, even if they continue to conduct human rights abuses and the like.
Okay, as far as the human rights abuses are concerned, I mean, the U.S. Congress, as we know, tried to curb Saudi or U.S. arms supplies to Saudi Arabia because of the war in Yemen. That was, of course, vetoed by President Trump. The U.K. has come under heavy criticism as well for its arms sales to Saudi from countless watchdogs now, as well as human rights groups. All of this, Sami, yet nothing changes. Is there any amount of pressure and scrutiny that could change the way the U.S., the U.K., and as well France, you mentioned as well, deals with Saudi Arabia?
Not at all, because Saudi Arabia is the most vital ally for these countries in the region. It's a vital ally in terms of security interests and economic interests. For Europe and for the US, Saudi is a cash cow, as is Qatar, as is the United Arab Emirates. These are countries that spend billions and billions of dollars in exchange for some sort of support and in exchange for keeping the regimes afloat. This is the way that the regime survive. Your question is essentially asking, is there any way in which the countries will give up on these vital allies? And the answer is no. Look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is engaged in social engineering of Saudi society. It's beginning a rapprochement with Israel under the table. Bin Salman is spending resources to maintain US troops in the region. If you're the president of the US, it doesn't matter what Congress says. There's no way the Pentagon or the US are going to suddenly decide that Saudi Arabia is no longer an ally. But I do think focusing on this particular angle can be quite problematic. And the reason I say that is, take, for example, the Yemen war. If Saudi suddenly decides to stop arming factions in Yemen, then you're left with Iran backing the Houthis and UAE backing the southern separatists. Then you have negotiations between these two parties because they're the strongest parties, and you have a divided Yemen, both under dictatorship, both who will continue to essentially put the Yemeni citizen under a period of brutal rule. So in other words, it's not as clear as black and white. But in answer to your particular question, Saudi is too valuable an ally to compromise as a result of, as Trump put it, somebody who didn't even have a green card in the case of Khashoggi.
You know, you mentioned at the very beginning, though, that you said these weapons imports are more about politics rather than about actually using the weapons themselves. But still, this was quite an arsenal Saudi is building up. Do you fear, you know, anything going forward as to what Saudi could actually use this accumulated arsenal for?
Saudi has an aversion to war. Saudi has very bad experiences when it comes to actually going to war. Every party that it backed in Yemen ended up losing. Khalid bin Sultan in 2009 decided to boost his credentials in a bid to become king and went to war with the Houthis in northern Yemen, and he was defeated. Saudi has been in the war in Yemen trying to rescue the internationally recognized government, and it can't even defeat a militia of the Houthis that is being backed by a sanctioned Iran. In other words, the Saudis actually don't have any appetite for war whatsoever. And if you look at the details of the arms that are actually being purchased, there's no expertise within Saudi Arabia to use a lot of these weapons. You'll remember that the Houthis or the Iranians or whoever decided to claim responsibility, when they attacked the Aramco oil facilities, the very US weapons they had purchased, the Patriot missiles, failed to protect those oil facilities. Either the Saudis were unable to use those weapons or those weapons are not fit for purpose. In other words, the thinking behind the contract is not military capability. It is to keep the US on board. And Donald Trump, who is, in my opinion, one of the most honest US presidents, in that he says US foreign policy as it is, said once upon a time that why would I give up my relations with Saudi, who are paying billions for weapons, who are pumping money into the US for the sake of somebody who does not have a green card. This is the essential, this is what is behind this policy of buying weapons. The UAE likewise. Think about it, and I'll finish on this point. France, what makes France stand up against the EU on matters of Libya or the Eastern Mediterranean? It is the fact that Macron has an economic crisis and the UAE are pumping billions to buy French weapons, in essence, to buy France, so that France stands with it in its expansionist policy in Libya and Mediterranean. And the fact of the matter is, as much as like it or not, this works. This has been the fabric of the foundation of the relationship between the Gulf countries and the US and Europe. It is these arms contracts. So while these human rights organizations complain about the human rights abuses, the reality is, unless you can find those hundreds of billions of dollars from somewhere else, there's no way the US are going to give them up for the sake of a few Arabs who are put under torture or killed by the Saudi or UAE regime.
It's fascinating, Sami, because, everyone was so shocked when this report was first released that, the arms purchases had increased 130%, all going to Saudi. And you're saying, actually, don't be too scared because this massive arsenal will mostly remain idle.
It's essentially, and also remember, the increase is not necessarily because Saudi suddenly feels there are new threats that it has to fight or it has to combat. And the proof is that it hasn't really moved against Iran either, and it went to Yemen because it felt it had no other choice. The reason for the increase is that Qatar and Saudi Arabia have been pumping billions into Donald Trump to try to convince Trump to stand by them. So if Saudi buys a Trump hotel, Qatar buys 2 Trump hotels. If Saudi buys, F-16s, Qatar decides to buy, tanks and the like. It's this competition. And Trump sits there in the White House and he says, guys, this is so cool. We have Qatar paying us here and Saudi doubling the money and then Qatar tripling the money. In other words, Trump is not losing. And this is why when he stands in front of the American people, he says, look at the amount of money I'm bringing in to the US. And when you look in the wars that Saudi are involved in, you don't see efficient use of these weapons. You don't see it being used to protect Aramco's arms facilities. But Saudi doesn't ask itself why these weapons are useless in protecting the oil facilities. Saudi says we need Donald Trump. The only way to keep Donald Trump on board is to spend these billions. So keep pumping that money because we need it. And any increase is as a result of this feud. So this is why the report may be shocking, but we need to look at the dynamics that are in the region. This is not new with Mohammed bin Salman. This is most Saudi rulers since the inception of the new state, of the modern Saudi state. This is how they keep the Americans on board. It doesn't matter if Congress comes up with these laws. The president has veto power. The Pentagon and the military advisors go to the president and they say, Mr. President, trust me. No matter what Congress says, we need these Saudis. And it's the money that talks.
Sami, great as always to have you. Thanks so much again for your analysis.